So I think we are also on time. So let's get started. And at this end of the very long day, or at least the conference part, so hopefully I can keep you awake while you deal with the last talk. This will be more of a collection of stories. So even if you zone out for a bit, it should still be okay, and you can pick up when you wake up again. So my name is Rasmus. I live here in Copenhagen, or just north of Copenhagen, with my family. I've been writing code for about 30 years now. 18 of those years have been professionally, or at least where I've done it full-time. I'm currently at Templafy. Previously, I've been at Microsoft and Xamarin. And I'm basically always building something. And that's also the reason that I'm giving this talk, is I'm fascinated with the whole idea of being able to build software, right? You don't really need anything. You just sit down with your computer and your imagination, and you can create something from nothing. And then I see colleagues and friends, and they might not be building software outside of work, and that's also perfectly okay. But at least I feel like I've gotten a lot out of it, and so I kind of wanted to share my story, at least about side projects. And so this is a story about the side project that I have, that I've put the most time into. So it's a website that I started 8 years ago. And then, of course, also, hopefully, you'll get some of my advice and my experience and what I've learned over the years. And so side projects, what is a side project? From the name, it's pretty clear that it's something that's not your main occupation, right? So it's something that you're doing outside of work, or studying, or whatever. And there's usually a lot of different reasons that people do side projects, right? And I at least have been burned by this a few times in the past, and my reflection has been that it's always good to just briefly think about, what am I trying to do here? Like, why am I writing this code? Because that will help you with whatever you're trying to accomplish. And the problem is that usually when you mix these together, you're going to have a bad experience, or at least everything is going to take a lot longer. And so I usually like to put side projects into 4 buckets. There could be 4 main reasons, at least for me, that I would try and create something. And the first 2 are more like internal reasons for me. One could be, I've been looking at Rust on Hacker News for the past 3 months. It's got a lot of hype. I want to try it out. I want to fight with the ownership model and everything. And so I want to learn something. That's the reason that I'm sitting down to write this code. Could also be that you actually want to create something. You have something in your life where you're thinking, I want to automate this. I want to create something that can help someone. I want to, whatever it might be. You're trying to create something. You're trying to get to something actually working. It could be a showcase. So it could be a demo for a presentation. It could be you trying to show off your skills for job hunting or other things. And what I find with showcase side projects is that they're usually very focused. It's usually less code, maybe higher quality, or at least showing some different property of what you're trying to show. And then, of course, it could be that you are starting a side project because you want to earn more money for profit. And I think while there might be things in this talk that you can use for that, there's also a huge amount of information on starting businesses and startups. And I think things here will mainly focus on the create goal, but I mean, some of it will be useful regardless, but I would recommend also looking into the whole startup, or the information on startups. So what I find with the ones that I mix up the most is these 2, right? The internal reasons. So I decide that I want to create something. I want to sit down. And the reason that this burns me is that if I want to learn something, and I also want to create something at the same time, usually I fall into all the friction that this new technology that I'm bringing in will have. And so it means that it takes a lot longer for me to create something. And so when I want to create something, usually my advice would be to take some technology that you know. One thing that's worked really well for me is to take the stack that I use at work, because that has other benefits. And usually it's a stack where you're already productive. And then, of course, there might be some technology that's necessary for your crazy idea that you're trying to do, but then at least try to reduce the amount of new things that you're taking in at the beginning. And actually, I would advise for the same thing with Learn, maybe don't take Rust and WebSockets and something new database, but then take one of them and take some technologies that you know. And this doesn't need to be a long process. It's just reflecting, just briefly before you start. It's just like, what am I trying to do here? Do I want to create something or do I want to learn something? And because you're usually constrained on something, and usually it's time. Yeah. And so, what might these side projects look like? I don't know, maybe created 100 side projects over the year, right? Some have been just an evening, some have been some code that I've been using for a long time. One example could be I created a Windows launcher for myself many years ago, 10 years ago by now, and I still use it every day. I think I'm the only user now, but it's available on GitHub if you want to try it out. But there are lots of Windows launchers these days, but I don't know. I had some users at work once, but yeah. Another thing could be to try and create some old Google AI competition. This is a side project called Space Battles. It's started as a hackathon weekend with Jasper, who's in the audience, and he's actually the one running it now. It could also be, and this is the only reference to AI in this talk, but this was actually, there were these competitions that were called Google AI competitions, and they were actually about writing bots that would then fight each other in this space world. Another application that you might write is that you want to create something for actually managing your life, notes, projects, tasks, whatever, and you just haven't been able to find the right tool for yourself. And this, if you look at the list over here, you can also see that this is one where I've basically been burned a lot on the technology front, and I'm on the nth rewrite of this app. But I'm actually pretty happy with it now. The main problem with an app such as this one is that you want something that's both cross-platform, but you also want your data to be local. And that turns out to be pretty complicated, especially if you're limited on time and effort. And so these are just 3 examples of side projects. There could be a bunch more. You probably have some interesting ones as well. And so this brings me to the main side project that I'm going to talk about today, which is called PoE.ninja. Kind of happened as an accident, but that is actually the full domain name of the site. And it is a website that tracks statistics in a video game called Path of Exile. And it's a bit random, but that's what I've been building for the last 8 years. And just for reference, who actually knows Path of Exile? Okay, there's a few people at least. That's good. I will give a short introduction to what Path of Exile is anyway. So Path of Exile is an ARPG, an action role-playing game. If you know Diablo or Last Epoch, then Path of Exile is very similar. It's a relatively old game. It was released, the first version in 2013, by a company called Grinding Gear Games from New Zealand. And I think what Path of Exile does really well is it really leans into complexity and gives you a lot of options. And I think some of the main parts that it really leans into is very deep character building. So the premise of the game is basically you have to build a character that will become increasingly better at killing monsters. Right? That's the point. And so it gives you a lot of tools to do that. And one infamous example is a bit hard to see here up on the monitor, but this is the passive skill tree from Path of Exile, and you can see that it's a huge graph. And basically, one of the things that you do when you create a character is that you make a path in this tree and pick up a lot of different bonuses that you want. And a quote over here from someone on Reddit, which is not an uncommon quote at all. I have 11,000 hours in this game, and I'm still learning something new every day. That talks a bit into the complexity of this game. And when you have something that's complex, it usually also means that software developers like me, who maybe are not so good at playing the game, we feel like, well, maybe at least I can play with some data and have fun. And just to give you a brief idea, let's see if this works. But here's just 20 seconds of gameplay, just if you haven't seen the game. I took one that's not too crazy on the movement and stuff, but this is what the game looks like, right? You have some lives, some mana, and then you basically run around and kill monsters. And it goes faster and faster, basically. All right. So, PoE.ninja. So, 8 years ago, I was playing this game with my friend, and Path of Exile has this player-driven economy, and that means that it's pretty hard to figure out what things are worth, and he was frustrated. He was like, I want to buy this item, I have all these things, I don't know what they're worth. I mean, how am I going to get from here to actually buying the things that I want? And he was like, I wish that someone would just create an overview that would show me what things are worth. And the game had recently released an API, and I thought, well, it sounds fun. I'll sit down for a weekend and I'll try and build something, and I did. And then I posted it on Reddit, and people really liked it. And I thought, okay, that was good, and it was useful to me as well. And so I thought, okay, let's just keep building this thing. And I kind of just kept on expanding it. And then here we are, 8 years later. I'm still building it. Like, there's been on and off times, of course. But you know, it's been my entertainment for the last 8 years when I've not been working. And so just to give you an idea of the scope of the project, it's written in C#, ASP.NET Core. It has a React frontend in TypeScript. It's processed nearly 500 terabytes of data from the API at this point. And it's served a lot more, for sure. It's about 50,000 lines of code. Usually the split is pretty even between C# and TypeScript, but I think I deleted a lot of TypeScript recently, so it's a bit heavy on the C# side now. And for the graph you see at the bottom here is the daily page views, and you can see that it goes into the range of maybe between 2 and 4 million page views per day, and that means that it is something in the range of maybe like 5,000 to 10,000 top website in the world. So that's where it's about. And for daily users, it's around 200,000 currently with the current leak that's going on. And you can also see here that Path of Exile is a game that actually has this leak. So every 3 or 4 months, they will release a new version, and then people will come back, and then it'll kind of go down, and then they'll come back, and you can see that has kept on going. They had some pretty unpopular leaks in 2022, as you can see, but then they kind of recovered from that in 2023. And so now we're getting into the whole story part about what did I actually learn then from doing this project over these last 8 years. And the first one I'm going to take you through is one called Embrace Constraints. And when you're starting a side project, you're going to be constrained in some way, right? You're going to be constrained financially. You won't have money to go out and buy a huge server. Like, there's no revenue, there's nothing. You can't buy an expensive database license. You will be constrained on time, for sure. This is a side project, it's not your main occupation. So time and energy, a lot of that will go into your main occupation, and then you're kind of doing this on the side. But you'll also be constrained on people, right? Most of the time, usually when you start up, you're just one person, or maybe a few. But it also means that there's a limit to how much code you can write. You can't write as much code as a team, but on the other hand, you also don't have to coordinate with a team, so you can make decisions a lot faster. So I mean, there are pros and cons, but you are definitely constrained on many things. And one of the constraints that I picked up recently that kind of became a design goal for me in this project was that because as it happened, I was deploying this site to an Azure app service, and because of the whole financial reasons, it had one core. And so I thought, Path of Exile is a big game, there's a big audience. Let's build this site so it can run on a single CPU core. That was kind of my design goal. And what does it mean to run on a single core? Well, it means that if you have a request that takes 1,000 milliseconds, then you're going to be serving 1 request per second, right? And if you go above that 1 request per second, bad things are going to happen. Like, your service is going to fall over and die. Like, you're going to go to 0 requests really quick. If you can bring it down to 10 milliseconds per request, then suddenly you can serve 100 per second, right? So you can actually serve a lot on a single core if you just if you build it right. And what you can see here on the bottom is actually from last week from my monitoring software. This is the response times from my backend measured by Nginx on the same server. But you can see that actually the 50th and 75th percentile, they're both 0, and then the 99th percentile is 0.011. And this is because Nginx doesn't report anything less than 1 millisecond. And so the 75th percentile of all requests take below 1 millisecond today, which makes me very happy because it means that I can still run it on very few resources. I've later, so I started out with a single core, but I've later expanded this to be a single server. So all the bad complexity happens when you go into multiple servers and distributed systems. I do that at work. But if you're a single person, keeping everything on one server really helps. So I'm fighting pretty hard to keep that. And so this went fine for about the first 2 years, but then I was like, oh, I've covered most of the economy in this game. Maybe I should try something new. And I was like, it's always hard with these characters. I always have problems figuring out exactly how to build. Maybe if I could build something where I would be able to explore data from how other people are building their characters. Maybe if I could do that, that would be helpful to add. But the economy part was pretty easy, right? I was collecting data, aggregating it, serving it. It's pretty simple to do on a single core. But then, this build site, this is what it looked like back then when I released it. It looks very different now, or at least somewhat different. But how do you build like faceted search, sorting, and search on a single core, right? That's gonna be hard with a big audience. And so I remembered a library I had seen that was called Cross-Filter, and it was made by Mike Bostock, who also created D3.js. And the approach they took was basically to say, we're gonna serve all the data to the front end, and then we're gonna just do all the filtering in the front end. And that sounded very appealing, like given my constraints, that sounded like a great idea. And so I had 2 challenges, right? There was 15,000 characters on the ladder of the game that I had to download, and then I needed to make sure that I could make this data set small enough so I could reasonably serve it to a front end. And then, of course, I needed to create some logic for actually filtering this. And it turned out that I could get it down to like maybe 5 megabytes of JSON, and if I gzipped that, it was like 500 kilobytes. That was acceptable, I could serve that. And Cross-Filter was using bit sets, and if you haven't looked into bit sets a lot, they're magical, and computers are really fast. The filtering was also really good with these bit sets just in JavaScript, and basically you had a short loading period, and then all the filtering was near instant, also on phones. So that was great, and this worked out well. And let me just show you exactly what it looks like today, just to give you an idea if you haven't seen the site. So this is basically a list of all the characters. You can see that the UI is a bit nicer now. And what you can also see here, like for instance, you can see the passive tree. This is a heat map of what the, now 97,000 characters are building. And if we go in and say, okay, I want to look at all the slayers, you can see that the heat map then changes, and we can dive in. So everything is basically, we can explore this data set, right? And we can kind of drill into the data, and it should be nice and fast and fun to explore. And you can actually also press the heat map and say, I want everyone who's actually using this node. And then it'll actually also filter the heat map. I don't think a lot of people know that. But now at least it's shared with the world. And so that was great. That was a fun experience. And something, I wouldn't have done it at work, right? I wouldn't have pushed all the data and doing the filtering on the front end. But because I had this constraint and I leaned into it, it became more of a creative challenge to find a solution to this problem. But the problems didn't stop there, unfortunately. So it turned out that 15,000 characters was not enough, because people were reaching the max level faster, and my site kind of got stale after that. So Grinding Gear Games released another API. I increased my goal to be able to serve 100,000 characters. But this also meant that the gzip JSON suddenly was maybe 5 megabytes. And so we're getting into the space where maybe it's not so fun to serve anymore, and also getting into the space where phones don't really like it anymore. Like, it's getting too much data. And so I started looking into, like, okay, how can I make this better and still keep my constraint running? And I looked at a lot of column databases. That's usually what you'll get into if you're looking at these analytical queries. And I tried out a lot of them, but they were all, they were not fast enough for what I was trying to do on a single server. And so I had an idea that I could try and build a database myself. But whenever you think that you should build a database yourself, you should stop, and you should not do it unless you look around and you're in a database startup. Then you can do it. But otherwise, don't go there. So I kind of put it off. I thought that's crazy. But a few months later, I decided to do a prototype and see, would it work? And it did work. And so I continued building it. And so I did build a database, but it was what I built was a very specialized database that is made for exactly this use case, and is also made to be very cacheable by Cloudflare, who's in front of my site. And so I think, in total, it's maybe 2,000 lines of C# code. So it's not a huge project, but I finished it and I launched it, and that was the one that you saw before, still very fast. And it actually responds to these queries in most of the time 1 millisecond, but then up to maybe 5 milliseconds, people doing crazy sorting or something. So that was quite fun, and again, I'll repeat, bitsets are magic. It's really the main driving force behind this database. And just to give you an idea, so there's 3,000 dimensions. You can see all the ones on the left. We need to do a count of each of them across 100,000 characters. So that's more than 300 million operations, right? 300 million comparisons. But because it's using bitsets, that's just very fast and can be done in 1 millisecond, which is amazing. But actually, I almost gave up on this back in 2021. Because I was at this point, I was at a server, a virtual server with 16 cores. And I had been watching my CPU usage go up and up as more users kind of used the site. And it had been very gradual, but this was what I was looking at in 2021. And this is before I did the whole, build a database stuff. And so I was looking at this graph and I was like, okay, maybe now is the time actually to drop my constraint. Maybe now is the time to start designing a distributed system, or at least figuring out how to offload some of this. And I tried profiling. It's pretty hard to know exactly what your production server is doing. I couldn't really find the root cause. But luckily, one day when I was profiling something else, the application startup time, I noticed that there was a bit of code that was collecting some data and serializing JSON and putting it into the HTML of the page. So basically, since I'm caching a lot in front of my site, I also include some IDs in the HTML to kind of break all the caching so that you can see the new data. And what clicked for me in that moment was that since this is embedded into the HTML, it means that this code will run on all the unique URLs that people hit. And so that's actually quite a significant amount of traffic coming into my site. And I thought, okay, I didn't really think that that was the issue at that point, but I thought, what the heck? Let me try and see. I'll just cache it. It doesn't change very frequently. So, I could just cache it for 1 minute, and that would kind of remove that load. And I did. And then I deployed it, and my server load fell to 4 cores. And so that's just also a note on whatever you think your production server is doing. I had no idea that my server was spending 10 cores serializing JSON for the HTML. That was crazy to me. So whenever you're guessing anything, and so this is not actually about side projects, this is about profiling in general. Whenever you have the idea of what a performance problem is, you need to measure, and you need to find the issue, because it's usually not what you think. So that was about leaning into constraints and using them as not a bad thing, but actually use them as a creative challenge. It's also because maybe I like solving these problems, and so that's what's good for me in a side project. So, incremental learning and innovation. So I told you in the beginning that you should think about not introducing a lot of technology when you're trying to create something. But it's fine to do it over time, right? Once you've worked on a side project for a little bit, you have a working base, and now is the time that you can start bringing in new technologies and you can play around with it, because these migrations that maybe take a long time at work, mostly because you don't want to have any downtime or anything else, they're actually pretty fast in when you're just one person, right? You can basically just change it. There's no training others. There's no discussions. You can basically just do it. And so these migrations that we're used to are very expensive, might not actually be so in a side project. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of lean into this over time. And also, this is also about the whole choosing the same tech stack as work, is that when you work on a side project, you're suddenly responsible for all of it, right? You're responsible for the whole stack. You're responsible for the server, the infrastructure, the pipelines, the backend code, the front-end code, everything. And it means that if you use the same stack as work, you're going to get into a lot of other corners that maybe other teams or other team members are responsible for at work. And that certainly means that you know a lot that others might not, which is very beneficial. At least this is one of the big benefits that I've found in my career, is that usually when people talked about something, I had played around with it in some random side project, and I would know something about it, more than just the documentation. And so the story I want to tell you here is actually just the evolution of the infrastructure to show you how that evolved over time and how I kind of grew it. Of course, it's natural that infrastructure will grow over time, but you can actually do relatively big shifts, especially when you're just one person. And especially if you also take some knowledge that you already have from work and you apply it. So this was the initial version that I told you about before, right? I had an Azure App Service, Azure SQL, and the Path of Exile API. And I was just deploying code directly from my machine because Azure App Service makes that pretty easy. So that was kind of the lowest friction I could take to just get something out. And so this is what it looks like today. And don't be scared by the whole Kubernetes thing. I'll get to that. But basically what happened is that in 2017, I moved off of Azure. I could see that that would not be realistic in terms of egress traffic and everything else, and also just scaling up the server a bit more. And this was also just about the time that ASP.NET Core actually was getting really solid on Linux. So I moved to a Linux server. I switched to Postgres, which I can definitely recommend. I put Nginx in front of it, and I added Cloudflare as well. And then in 2018, I added pipelines. I added Humio for monitoring, because we were using it at work. And it was really nice to use. I also, by this time, had moved servers a few times, and we had used Ansible at a previous job, so I introduced some Ansible scripts for provisioning my machines. So whenever I moved to a new server, whenever I needed to scale up further, I would apply my Ansible scripts. Then in 2019, I added another community tool from the Path of Exile community called the Path of Building to do a lot of the calculations for me, and I put this in a Docker container. And then in 2022, because I was looking for better ways to do zero downtime deployments, I then added Kubernetes. But again, this is the scuffiest Kubernetes installation that you've ever seen, right? It's a single node Kubernetes cluster that mounts stuff directly from disk, right? It's not a complicated version of Kubernetes. It's basically just the bare essentials of Kubernetes, which I already had a good idea about from work, but I definitely got deeper in like this. But the main purpose that I have Kubernetes here is to manage the Path of Building Docker instances and do zero downtime deployments on my main Docker image. So it's the least complicated Kubernetes setup you can do, basically. And so this is just to give you an idea of how it can evolve over time, and then just taking stuff that you already know from work and then slowly building it out. And none of these migrations have been very bad. I mean, I think the worst one was probably the Postgres one, because changing databases always hurt a little bit. And lately I've been exploring Cloudflare R2, which is an alternative to S3 and blob storage, basically for some more file storage. And also, you can see, also integrated a few more APIs. And so the next thing is that when you have a side project, it's important to remember that it is, in fact, a side project. And I think, especially if you have a long-running side project like this one, sometimes you will get lost in the project and you will start thinking about, how can I grow this site? How can I make all these things better? And maybe they're not the thing that you want to do, but it's the thing that you think is the logical next step for the site. It's the right thing to do for the product. And I know that I'm at least actively working on, I remind myself of this, that this is my side project. This is something that's supposed to give me energy, something I'm supposed to be passionate about, because like, why else would I be doing it? And so I actively have to take out of the how do I grow the site and think, okay, what do I think is fun? Like, what do I want to do next? And is that to, dive into machine learning, or is it something else? There's always a ton of options, always a ton of things that you can do. But I think it's important to remember that this exists to, if you are actually looking to create something, it's important to remember to optimize for fun, because otherwise you might just stop doing it. And so one of the things that I've decided is that it's not open source. There's been a number of people over the years that have asked whether or not they could contribute, and of course I'm happy that they would. And it would be great to have some more development power on the site. But I realized pretty early that this is my playground. This is where I get my energy. And especially as my career has progressed and I've moved further away from code, having this project that I can go back to and I can play around with code and actually, feel the metal, it really helps me also keeping my programming skills up to date. And again, if I have to make technology choices at my job, me having played around with it, at least that's how I work. I don't like reading about things. I like using it. That's how I learn. So I need this project to and I want to write code. I don't want to manage pull requests. I don't want to manage issues. I'll take the occasional bug report. I respond to people that write to me. But I don't want all the, I just want to write some code. That's basically the goal of the project. And the other story here is a bit of a sad one, at least for me. But so in 2020, after I had released this build site, I suddenly got an email from, and you can see that everything looks a bit funky up here. It's because it's in Korean. But I got contacted by a company called Kakao Games, and they are a Korean company that runs the Korean realm in Path of Exile, and they had a problem. They had a bunch of users that really wanted to use my site, and there was a huge language barrier for them. The English was not good for them. So they reached out to say, like, can we figure something out? We're happy to help with translations and other things that you need, but can you provide the site in Korean? And I thought, I mean, sure. I would give it a try. And I built a small translation system for the front end. I spent some time extracting language data from the game files. It took a few weeks. It wasn't a huge task. And actually, I reached out to Grinding Gear Games. They were nice enough to also use their translators to translate all the UI strings I had. So I actually launched this with 7 languages, which was super nice. And then everything kind of slowed down a little bit. Because what I hadn't thought about is that when I added this translation system, it actually meant that I suddenly couldn't do changes anymore. I didn't have a team supporting me. I didn't have someone who could go out and create new translations. So if I wanted to change the UI and break something up, I would now need to go and find these translations somewhere. And I would need to create new translation strings and everything. And that adds a lot of friction when you only have one person's time. And it was also work that I didn't think was fun. And so I kind of slowed down my pace. I didn't really know why at the time, but I stopped working on the site as much. And then I think in 2023, I kind of realized what it was. And I took the somewhat painful decision of ripping out the entire translation system and deleting it, because it meant that I wasn't building the site. And if I have to optimize for fun, it also means that it needs to be something that keeps me building. And this was taking all the energy out of the work for me. And yeah, I was sad to remove it because I know that it helped some people, but it was the only path forward for me. And of course, if I had had a team, if it had been a company, if something else, then it might have been a different story. But it's just me, so that was the decision. And that really helped a lot, though. That was the good part. I really picked up the development. So you can also see this is in 2023. This is just before I did the whole, build your own database idea thing. And so the last section here is unexpected events. So if you build something like this and it takes off, you're also going to have some weird things happening. Of course, like it's over 8 years, right? I think the Cacao game one was also a bit unexpected. And so the first one that I'll tell you about here is back in 2018, after I'd launched the build site. There's a big Chinese company called Tencent who bought a large chunk of Path of Exile and Grinding Gear Games. And I got some emails from them. And again, here there was a pretty large language barrier. And they were talking about a project. I didn't really know what it was. I tried to ask. They responded, but I didn't really understand what they were trying to do. I wished them luck with the project, and the conversation kind of died down. And then a few months went by, and I didn't think any more of it. And then I wake up one morning, and I'm like, my Reddit inbox is like full of messages. I have an email from Tencent in my inbox as well. They're talking about the launch of their project. And I'm a bit confused. I don't know exactly what they're talking about. But I click the link, and I see this. And so if you remember what you saw before, this looks familiar. So this, do you remember that I told you that I built the build site in a way where you just needed to supply the data from the backend? Well, that's what they did. So they had copied my front-end code, and they had implemented a new backend, and then they had launched that on the Chinese realm. And I was a bit surprised. And I wrote back to them, and we discussed back and forth. I also talked to Grinding Gear Games, and they were helpful. And it turned it was a misunderstanding. They thought that I had okayed this, and we talked back and forth. How can we do this? I knew for a fact that I wouldn't go into the Chinese realm. The Chinese API is in Chinese, and yeah, let's not go back to the languages, even though this happened before. But I knew that I didn't want to enter the Chinese realm, and so in the end, I said I was actually okay with them running this on the Chinese realm because I knew that it would help people, and I said, just don't bring it to the international realm, and also could you add a link back to my site? And they added this thing at the top. You can see the green one there, and it's a small button that says something I can't read, Ninja. Something I can't read, Rasmus. And it says, I believe it says like, special thanks to the Ninja author Rasmus. And to this day, this site is still running, by the way, but to this day, this button up here is actually one of my largest direct traffic sources, which is a bit, but this wasn't unexpected. So I mean, I can cross off the whole, running on a large Chinese company website off my list. The second one was Torchlight Infinite that launched in 2022. It's also an ARPG, also very, very inspired by Path of Exile. And they reached out to me, and probably also other community builders in Path of Exile, and asked, do you want to build a site for this new game that we're launching? And I thought, looks kind of Path of Exile. There was a lot of the systems that were the same. I thought, I have all this tech for my build site. I could probably build one, and that would probably be fun. And I said, yeah, sure. I can build a build site. I would give that a shot. And they were like, no, they're not really looking for a build site. They were thinking more like a wiki or something else. Okay, that's fine. But I decided to try out the game, and I played it for a while, and then I found out why they didn't want the build site. And that's because inside the game, there was this thing. And if you look at it, it is, there's the main skill 5 link plus. And if you go over to my site, you have my main skill 5 link plus. So, I mean, it's not a complete copy, but it's very similar. So that turns out the reason they didn't want the build site is they had already built it inside the game, basically. So yeah. And the last one of these stories here is ExileCon. So Path of Exile or Grinding Gear Games held a conference last year called ExileCon. And because of this project, I decided to buy a ticket and travel to New Zealand. Again, I cannot recommend traveling to New Zealand for 6 days, but the trip was good, and it was really amazing. I got to talk to a lot of players that are much more hardcore at Path of Exile than me, for sure. And more importantly, I got to talk to a lot of the other community tool creators at the event, and also got a chance to talk to a lot of people from Grinding Gear Games, and also especially to sit down with the web team, which are the people that I collaborate mostly with at Grinding Gear Games, and the ones that are doing all of the API work. So yeah, that was a big experience that I definitely wouldn't have done if it hadn't been for this project. And yeah, I think that kind of concludes the war story part of this. So to recap, I would encourage you to go and build something. Can be a small thing. As I said, I think I've done 100 side projects. This is the biggest one. It can also just be a small thing that you automate today that will help you tomorrow, or maybe you'll discard it, but you'll probably learn something. But when you do, pick an appropriate approach for what you're trying to do. Just reflect, think, what am I trying to do here? Am I creating or learning, especially? Be mindful of your constraints. Use them as a force instead of seeing them as a limitation. Find creative ways around these building blocks. And again, you'll learn a lot as you go. You'll also do things that you would never do at work. And that will seem like horrible ideas, but turn out to actually work. Add innovation and new tech as you go. Try to reduce it in the beginning. And remember to have fun. And I think that also brings us to the end. And yeah, remember to evaluate the talk. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. And if you want a ninja sticker, you can also come up here and get one. Question?
Do you have to put any money into this?
No.
Okay. You don't pay for the hosting, or does Cloudflare sponsor you? Or?
I actually also pay for Cloudflare, one of the plans. But I do have ads on the side, so it does generate some revenue. So I don't pay for the hosting anymore.
As a follow-up to that, but did you get any offers to sell the website or monetize it in any other way?
I have had both people wanting to sell RT ads on my site, at least, and there has been some people interested in buying the site. Yes, I've had some conversations, but I decided to keep it. Any other questions? One?
What features can we expect you to?
What do you want?
I'm not sure.
Okay. No, I was thinking about one of the things that exists in many other game statistics sites is actually so this is very power user, right? This is like, you need to know what you're doing. I want to look at juggernauts. I want to see, I want to look at, a specific skill. You still need to know a lot of this. It's hard to see exactly what's popular. So one thing I've considered is to actually do a more like condensed, what is the current meta, what are the popular builds, more like an overview instead. Another thing I recently started is to actually, whenever this overview is created, I'll actually save some Parquet files that I'm going to try and look at in DocDB and see if I can generate some good information over time on like what ascendancies and skills and stuff have been popular over time. So things like that. Another area that I want to go into, which is a bit hard, is I would love to try and do some machine learning on some of this data. But there's a lot of different options that you can go for. And like, if you have any ideas, then like write me and I'll look at it. I have a very long list of things I want to do, but usually some people also come up with better ideas. Yes?
How often do you still play?
I'm playing right now. I still play. I usually play every league. I had, in the years where it kind of slowed down, I didn't play as much. But I do still play every league, mostly also just to keep the site up to date. But I mean, with the current league, I've been having some fun as well. Yes.
How open are the grinding games to like exposing their data for the community to use? Because, for example, I'm also invested in another game called Trackmania, and the developers, don't expose any official APIs. They don't really mine the community kind of data mining the internal APIs to use, but basically they not give any guarantees that this won't change, and they're usually like pretty secretive when it comes to like aggregating like player numbers or
Yeah.
any other data.
I think they are fairly protective, but they're also collaborating with community sites for sure. I think the main limitation is probably people. I think Grinding Gear Game is primarily a game design studio. They build games. They don't build APIs. That's not their main thing. So they do have the web team that I know of that create APIs, but it's not the primary thing that happens at Grinding Gear Game. So I think that's also why sometimes that will just be lagging behind. I think it's just a lack of manpower because they're really right now they're also building Path of Exile 2, which is a huge a huge thing. And so I think it's I don't think they are conscious about privacy issues and stuff. Definitely some limitations around that when using their APIs. But other than that, they've made a lot of data available at least. I think what they say is also don't monetize calling our API more. Please don't do that, right? But other than that, I think they are relatively open. Yes.
How much time, like a week or month, have you been spending on this? I'm sure it ebbs and flows, but
It varies a lot. I think just like leagues and Path of Exile, my effort also goes up and down whenever I also have a need to build stuff. But I think anywhere from most weeks it'll probably 1 to 5 hours or something like that. But some things, if I'm like building a database or something else, it might be more. If I'm doing something like that I think is fun. I usually have too many things active that I want to do at once in this project. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of ongoing stuff that is unreleased. Yes.
with this quiet activity, have your site ever been down?
Yes, it has. It has but that was actually not my fault. But there was a new version. It's been down for other reasons. I accidentally deleted the database once, but actually, since none of my APIs actually call the database, the site was actually not down. But it has been down once because there was an ASP.NET upgrade at some point where they had an API that was supposed to be async. And in that version, I think it was like 2.2. It's a long time ago. But they had a bug where that was suddenly synchronous instead of async. And because I am handling a lot of traffic on one server, that single thing just caused my CPU to max out and just die. And it was actually pretty hard to actually deploy a new version because the server was completely overwhelmed. But other than that, I don't think so. No. Any more questions? Otherwise, also, I'm here the entire conference, so just come and find me or find me on Discord. One more question?
How helpful was that initial constraint of basically serving it on, was it like one core?
One core?
One core, yeah, and preventing, I guess, over-engineering the whole system.
I don't know. I think I just made the decision that I would serve everything from either memory or static file. That was kind of the initial thought I had. I just knew that I had very limited resources. I knew that the community was big. So I was like, I need to do something to do it. And if you think about it, having economy data, it is very much just about collecting all this data and then running some aggregations over it. And so producing an overview in a JSON file instead of creating that overview on every request makes a lot of sense regardless. So it kind of it fell naturally out of the problem as well. But I did think about, this is going to be a problem if anyone uses it. But the other thing I have is like, if you are doing data, it has to be fast, right? If you're exploring data, you have to be able to click and get a response quickly, because otherwise it's not going to be fun. You're not going to be, if you're waiting 3 seconds every time you click one of these filters, you're not going to be exploring, you're not going to be looking at the data for very long. All right. Looks like the questions have stopped. Thank you.